Welcome to Your Idaho, brought to you by the Gem State Patriot. My name is Bob Neugebauer. My guest today is Senator Mike Crapo. I'd like to thank you, Senator, for taking the time out of your busy schedule to spend some time with us today. We have a lot of issues to cover, so I suggest we get started.
All right. Thanks, Bob, for having me here. I appreciate it.
It's a pleasure. The other night at the town hall meeting at the VFW hall, you mentioned that you didn't get any questions on Common Core, and it happens to be one of my pet peeves here in Idaho. So I'd like to ask you a few questions about the issue. It's a very contentious issue here in Idaho.
Yes.
57% of the people, and that's in a teaching group, have said they don't like Common Core. Mm-hmm. But we still have it here. As you know, we've been trying to get rid of the SBAC test, and in the past legislative session, we had a resolution signed by 35 organizations which represented over 20,000 households in Idaho, that was sent down to our legislators by email and by hand, dropped into their individual mailboxes. I received absolutely no returns on any of these. Oh, excuse me, I did get one Democrat that did send me back the fact that they received it. But we tried to get only a hearing is all we wanted on the SBAC test or on Common Core. And evidently, the chairman of the committee, Representative Reed DeMordaunt, decided that he did not want to have this issue brought up. And he just blocked it totally. So we couldn't get it done. We actually had a meeting with the chairman, and we asked him about Common Core, related to him that both the Republican National Committee and the Idaho Central Committees have come out against Common Core. And he acted like he didn't even know about these positions. What would be your opinion of someone like that, or how would we go about getting him to actually listen to the people? I mean, we did vote him in, and he's in my district.
Well, Bob, I think the best thing that can be done in those kinds of circumstances is exactly what you're doing, but step it up. Those at the state and, frankly, at the school board level, as well as at the federal level, who are engaged in these policy decisions, must recognize the concerns that are being raised. I have constituents from all over Idaho raising this issue to me all the time. And I believe that the state legislature, as well as the local school boards, is the right place for this decision to be made. And I'll talk a minute about the federal system. But the bottom line is that we need to recognize the concern. I can tell you, it's across Idaho. There is strong concern about whether Common Core is the right curriculum. And a big part of that concern is a concern that the federal government is driving this curriculum decision. And you're probably aware, I introduced legislation this Congress that would do two simple things. It would stop the federal government from mandating or incentivizing or penalizing a state or a school district for adopting any curriculum. Get the federal government out of curriculum. And the second thing that my amendment did was to ban the federal government from imposing any testing regime at the federal level.
What would that have to do with the No Child Left Behind Act, which I understand has been revised and redone, and that has gone in through the House and the Senate? Where does that stand, and where do you stand on it?
I voted against that bill, but let me explain. It did do some good things. I've been working to revise the No Child Left Behind Act since its passage, basically, because it essentially moved the federal government far down the road into the position of being a federal or national school board. And there are a lot of parts of the No Child Left Behind system that essentially put the federal government, the U.S. Department of Education, in charge of curriculum decision and testing decisions and school evaluations and so forth. And so I introduced the bill I just referenced to you this Congress. The committee that deals with this drafted a bill of its own, and they took parts of what I had put in my bill, but not all of it. The bill that did pass the Senate and the House and did go to the President did actually make significant strides in pulling the federal government out of the curriculum decision. The advocates for it argue that they have taken curriculum out of the federal regime. I hope that's right, but it did make good progress. And they did back off on the testing a little bit. They said the federal government couldn't mandate a specific test, but they could still mandate testing. In addition, even though it did those two good things and did some other very good things in pulling back the federal government, the bill still left in place a significant amount of federal mandates and federal control over the school boards and the state policymakers. And so I voted against it.
Well, the 95% rule, which is what they have now, if you do not have 95% of the students taking the SBAC test, then they have, or they say they will, cut the funds.
That's right.
Now, can they actually do that, or is this just a veiled threat?
No, they can do that.
They can.
Now, this bill, like I say, I voted against it, but it did do some good things, and it did pull back that leverage that the federal government has in terms of using funds to incentivize curriculum or testing or what have you. And I believe this bill actually makes it so that the states can choose which test to apply, but still mandates that the tests have to apply a test and still subjects the states to evaluation of their testing regimes in return for federal funding. And so it's still in place.
But isn't this a form of extortion?
It is, absolutely. The federal government should not be a national school board, and in fact, the federal government should not be imposing threats. This is nothing short of a threat to say to the schools and the state policymakers that if you don't do what we want, then you're not going to get your federal support.
Well, let me hit you on a couple of other quick things. Title IX, which is coming in and is coming down on the transgender in the schools, not just in our colleges, but also in our high schools and our grammar schools. That plus the fact that we're going to see some dramatic changes if indeed we can get some traction on finding more private schools that will take our students. In other words, I would prefer to see the money follow the students rather than the students follow the money.
That's exactly right.
What would you think about a tax credit for the parents so that they can pick and choose the school they want to go to and still have it to be constitutionally viable?
I think it's a good idea. And in one form or another, we've voted on those kinds of things. In fact, we had an amendment to this education bill that I just referenced that failed, but which I supported, that would have provided that the money follows the student, as opposed to having the federal government be able to use that money in order to leverage the school boards or the state departments of education.
How do you feel about ESAs, education savings accounts?
Oh, I think they're great things. Just like health savings accounts
Right.
are great things. The more that we can facilitate in our tax code as well as the rest of our policy, the ability of individuals to control their own decision making, whether it's about their children or their family's education or whether it's about their own health care, the better it will be. I think that, I'm sorry to push this a little toward health care, but whether it's health care or education, the idea that we will allow people to save their own money without having to be taxed on it so that they can use it in the way they choose to use it for these important things is a very, I think it's one of the biggest pieces of some of the solutions that we need to put into place at the federal level in these areas.
Well, thanks for that. I'd like to get going here. We got so many other things to cover. I'd like to talk about one of the hottest issues that we have right here in our state currently is the resettlement of the Syrian Muslims.
Yes.
The refugees that have not been vetted by their own government, nor the FBI knows what some of their backgrounds are. And understand that the estimates are 65,000 Muslim refugees are going to come in to 190 cities, including Boise, St. Mary's, and Twin Falls, in the next year. Now, we take in hundreds of thousands of Muslims, and I've seen the charts going back to 2002. And it's gotten to be more and more refugees every year. You know, how do we stop the inflow of the Muslims and also the illegal immigration that takes place across our borders in Mexico?
Two very big issues. Let me start with the refugee issue. And you are right, there is pressure right now for us to bring in 65,000 new refugees. And by the way, that pressure is coming from the United Nations.
Right.
And so the issue of who makes the decision is another big piece of this. We should not be letting the United Nations tell us what our refugee policy should be. There is a proper place for refugee and asylum policy in the United States. For example, the Christians who are being persecuted in the Middle East, I think would be good candidates for support by the United States in receiving asylum and protection. A gentleman in one of my town meetings recently, with tears in his eyes, brought up the situation where as he fought in Iraq, some of the local Iraqi citizens provided intelligence to our troops to help them protect themselves and achieve their missions. And then the United States backed out on them, and they were killed ruthlessly by our enemies in Iraq. Those kinds of circumstances are where our refugee policy should apply.
But they're very specific.
They are. That's exactly right. And we've allowed our refugee policy to get way out of control. And frankly, I agree with you. The federal government, I don't see how the federal government adequately vets those that it is bringing in, particularly if it agrees with the United Nations to bring in 65,000. You realize 65,000 is half for the whole world, half of the amount of refugees that the United Nations is pushing to relocate.
Sure.
And they're asking the United States to bring in half of them for the whole world. And we've had officials at the FBI tell us that they don't have the ability to vet them. And I think this is a very serious issue.
Well, why aren't we trying to bring in the Christians who are being persecuted in all of these Muslim communities overseas?
I don't know the answer. I think the answer is that we are allowing the United Nations to make the decision as to who is on the list of who gets to be relocated. And one of the things that I think we need to do at the federal level is to review this program very carefully to be sure that we don't let it just explode in its size beyond those legitimate areas where we should have proper asylum policies, and to allow the United States to make the decision as to who gets reallocated. The notion that we would let the United Nations decide for us who will be brought into our country is, in my opinion, a very dangerous situation.
Well, I think a lot of people agree with you. Are you aware of Representative Brian Babin of Texas' introduction of the Resettlement Accountability National Security Act? That's H.R. 3314.
I am aware of it. And I think that it needs to be revised a little bit, because I agree with everything in the bill. Basically, what the bill does is it requires an analysis of our refugee program to see what it's costing us and exactly who is being brought in and what the circumstances are of what our refugee program has grown into. I agree with all of that. I think we need to revise the bill a little bit, because the bill shuts down the entire refugee program for an undetermined period of time. Well, and I think that at least, as you said, a limited and a focused part of it needs to be maintained.
So you would have certain exceptions to this, but basically suspend the bulk of these refugees coming over here, at least for now.
Definitely. As I said earlier, it's the United Nations who's trying to jump this figure up to 65,000. And there are a number of senators in the United States Senate who have written a letter to the administration saying, do that. We should not do that. And absolutely, I agree that we should not take that step.
I'd like to get to something that's a little closer to home. The firefighters have been in Soda Springs fire in Hawaii. It's now 70% contained. The fire's burned almost 300,000 acres, done insurmountable damage. We continue to allow the BLM, the Forest Service, to continue to manage our forests here in Idaho when they do such a terrible job at it. You only have to drive through the Sawtooth Mountains and look at the forest and see how many dead trees there are and how much tinder there is on the forest floor. I don't understand why the state or somebody is not suing the Forest Service for the mismanagement of these properties.
I think you may see some of those kinds of lawsuits filed. One of the areas, we have a lot of disagreement in America and in Idaho over how to manage our public lands, the federal as well as the state lands. But one of the areas that I think there is a growing consensus in is that the system we now have is becoming very dysfunctional. We are not getting the adequate management of our public lands. And so I wouldn't be surprised if that kind of litigation is started. And I would think that kind of litigation could push the Forest Service and the BLM to improve their operations. I would tell you that in addition to that kind of pressure, though, I think we need to focus on reforming the law, which I think the law itself, which facilitates what I call conflict resolution decision-making rather than principled resolution-making that is facilitated by the people who live in the area where the land is. And I've been working very hard, as you're probably aware, to promote a system in which the law facilitates collaborative decision-making, where we allow the people who live where the land is to participate in collaborative decision-making about how the land should be managed. And we're actually having some success on that in a number of parts of the state.
How do you feel about Congressman Labrador's bill trying to get these parcels to be managed in percentages throughout the state? And that is a form of cooperation.
Yes, it is. Yeah, Congressman Labrador's bill is essentially creating a pilot project and letting the states manage part of these lands to see if we can analyze how to get that done and see if it works. Because as you know, we have this huge debate about whether that will cost too much money to the state or whether the state has the capability to manage properly, which I think the state clearly does. But I think that what we need to be sure of is whether we're doing it in a pilot project, as Congressman Labrador has proposed, or whether we're doing it under our current situation, or in any aspect of it at federal or state control. We need to remember that the process for making those decisions still should focus heavily on collaboration and create processes whereby instead of having a government decision maker just say, this is how we're going to run the land, have the people empowered. I go even beyond the state, down to the local levels where the local people live and where the stakeholders live, and letting them all become involved in a truly empowered process, one which the law recognizes to help drive these decisions and actually achieve win-win solutions for the management of our public lands.
Well, I'm all for trying to find cooperation, but we have found very, very little cooperation with either the Forest Service or the BLM, and we've seen some of the things they've done, like down at the Bundy Ranch and a few other spots, where they just kind of get on their high horse and they say, you're going to do it our way or the highway, forget it. My point here is that it's our land. 62% of that land the feds are running right now. We are losing economically. That's why our state is as poor as it is. And when you have an average median income in this state for a family of four, $46,000 a year, that's abysmal compared to the other states because we do not have access to our natural resources. And I don't understand why somebody's not fighting for that harder.
Well, I agree with you. When we see the heavy hand of the federal government stepping in these regulatory environments and driving the kinds of decisions that you've just talked about, it just makes Idahoans, particularly those who live in the locations where these rules or prosecutions or activities are undertaken, it makes them more frustrated and more furious. I talk to county commissioners all over Idaho who talk about the impact on their county budgets. We know that the mills in the timber community have been dying off in Idaho for years now because the management process does not allow adequate access to the forest for our timber industry and our wonderful men and women and their families who serve in these communities. And I think that we need to have changes in federal law that increase the ability of those decisions that you're just talking about to be moved away from a distant federal decision maker and moved into the arena of a really a more locally focused, stakeholder focused process where we can achieve good results. And I want to say, I know some criticize collaboration by saying that, well, one group can file a lawsuit and undercut the entire collaborative process. And that's true, and that happens. But the fact is we are showing through this process that we can actually significantly diminish the litigation and actually achieve better results. It's clearly not there yet, but we are making progress.
Well, I hope somebody's making progress because I just don't see it when it comes to the Forest Service or the BLM. We are losing more and more timber every year.
We are.
147 million acres have burned here in the last 30 years. And our timber production has been cut down to about a third to a quarter of what it used to be. When we were harvesting timber, we didn't have these fires. The fires were half of what they are.
That's right.
They have just gotten worse because we have no access to take out the timber. You have a fire, you want to take the timber out, and you can't get access to it because somebody's suing you, or the BLM says no, or the Forest Service says no. That's not cooperation as far as I'm concerned on the other side.
No, I agree with that. And like I said, we haven't arrived yet, but we've increased by tens of millions of board feet the amount of access that we do have to the forests. And we're continuing to fight on a number of fronts to get back. We need to get into much, much greater harvest. You're absolutely right about the fact that our access to timber harvest, for an example, is dramatically reduced over what it was historically, and our lack of ability to properly manage these lands through proper timber activities and through proper fire management has dramatically increased the risk of fire. We are now seeing catastrophic fires. The Forest Service recently put out an analysis of its own that says if we don't change this system, we are going to see the firefighting budget alone consume the entire budget of the Forest Service.
It's $36 billion.
Yeah.
I mean,
it's incredible.
That's a huge amount of money that we're spending on fires that we could actually be in production and take those resources, those natural resources, those God-given resources we have, and utilize those to increase the GDP of this state and move us forward.
So not only is the cost phenomenal in terms of what we are spending on it, but the loss of revenue, and what that translates into is the loss of jobs for families in our rural communities in Idaho is phenomenal. And I agree with that. I just want to say, you asked the question earlier, we need to fight harder for that. I, for one, believe that there are a number of fronts on which this fight is taking place. You referenced Congressman Labrador's bill. There's legislation in the Senate introduced by Senator Barrasso. There's legislation in the House introduced there to try to move us away from a litigation and conflict-oriented decision-making process, and one in which there is an overlord, to one in which we have greater opportunity for people to get involved in making those decisions. And I'm fighting aggressively to expand those opportunities. But one way or the other, we have to deal with this. You're absolutely right.
Let's get on to a real touchy subject, and that's something that has come up here. In fact, our governor said the other day on Planned Parenthood that he was not going to investigate Planned Parenthood here in Idaho. As we all know, since the disclosure of the videos that showed the actual sale going on of body parts, Planned Parenthood is still receiving public funding. How do you feel about them still receiving that public funding? Should it be cut off? And should there be an investigation, or should we just take their word that everything is fine here?
It should absolutely be cut off. And by the way, we had that vote in the Senate. We didn't win it yet, but we will fight that fight again. There should be an investigation. And that in the Senate, the Judiciary Committee, headed by Senator Chuck Grassley, has started an investigation. And I can tell you, Chuck Grassley will do a thorough investigation into these claims. I personally, I've viewed the videos. I don't see how a person on either side of the abortion issue, those for right to life or those on the choice side or whichever side of it you're on, I don't see how you can justify this practice. In those videos where they talk about literally manipulating the baby's body in the womb in order to properly be able to terminate the pregnancy, kill the baby, and save the baby's body parts, is to me such an abhorrent practice that we must take strong action to change it. And I believe that although we lost the vote in the first round of the battle in Congress, we will continue that fight, and we will continue to push on it.
Well, some individual states have actually gone out and started to do investigations. I called up our Attorney General here, and their spokesman said that it's not in their purview to do these. Talking to a constitutional attorney, who I happen to know and are close friends with, said we do have the purview. They do have the purview to do this. But nobody seems to want to get involved because it's such a hot topic.
Well, I would think that we should have investigations at both the federal and the state level. As I said, I have openly and publicly encouraged and endorsed our investigation in the United States Senate, which is taking place. And I do believe we should have further investigations because, frankly, the argument is made, and the criticism of those of us who voted on it in the Senate was made, that we are depriving women, particularly women who don't have the means or the ability to get adequate access to health care, that we are depriving them from access to health care if we eliminate this funding. And so let me clarify right here for all of the viewers, what we did was not just defund Planned Parenthood, but we transferred all of the funding from Planned Parenthood to our community health clinics in Idaho. There are, I think, 75 community health clinics in Idaho. There's 3 Planned Parenthood facilities. This was actually an improvement of women's health,
right,
rather than an undercutting of women's health. So on whatever issue you look at it, we need to study this. We need to get the facts out to the people. And like I say, I don't think that anyone from whatever position they come from on the political spectrum could see those videos and not feel that the practice had to be stopped.
Well, I agree with you, and I think there should be some investigations out here. We have one of the biggest clinics in the Northwest right here in Meridian.
Uh-huh.
And I, for one, would like to see something like that happen. But again, that's up to the governor and his group.
Mm-hmm.
But our legislators, at least, are going after it. I'd like to get to something else here. Supreme Court term limits is something that's been talked about in the news. There was a poll done by Reuters in coordination with Ipsos. 66% of Americans would favor a 10-year term for Supreme Court justices, and only 17% would prefer lifetime terms. Where would you come down on something like that?
Well, you know, I'll be honest, my initial reaction to this has been not to support it. My thinking is that, first of all, I want the judiciary to be independent of the legislature or the political process to as much as degree as we can. I understand there's politics in the Supreme Court.
No kidding.
Yeah, and that's kind of a comment on some of the most recent court cases that have come down. But when I look at it, if you look at the last 25 years, 16 of those years would have been Bill Clinton and Barack Obama making the decisions on new Supreme Court justices, and I just really worry about that, to be honest with you. I actually think that if we had term limits, a 10-year term limit in place over the last 25 years, that we would have a court that would be devastating us on issue after issue after issue. We would not have seen that case upholding the individual right to bear arms under the Second Amendment. We'd have seen the reverse. And so that's the reason I have concern about it.
Okay. With the Supreme Court ruling on same-sex marriage, many believe that this is just a prelude to attacks on our churches and on our religious freedoms. What will you do as our senators to provide protection for religious rights here in Idaho?
Well, I'm a co-sponsor of the legislation, excuse me, I'm a co-sponsor of the legislation that I think you're probably familiar with. It's running in the House and in the Senate, that clarifies that notwithstanding the Supreme Court decision that does say that that a same-sex marriage is constitutionally protected, it says that does not mean that those who have a religious opposition to same-sex marriages and who have a religious support of the traditional one-man and one-woman marriage are forced to engage in that practice or to support it. And let me give you a couple of examples. Obviously, I think that this law should protect a person, a minister, from having to conduct such a marriage if he or she had an opposition to it in their religious beliefs. I think that religions should not lose their tax-free status under our Internal Revenue Code if their beliefs are that they support the traditional marriage. And there are a number of religions right here in Idaho who would face that kind of a problem if the ruling were interpreted to move that far. And the list goes on and on. But my point is that the religious freedom of those who believe otherwise must be protected, and I support the legislation that's been introduced to do so.
Well, I do know that Section 32 of the ruling on the Supreme Court does give some protections to churches. I'm not sure how far it goes, but I know for a fact that the gay rights groups have been calling around to the churches to find out whether they would do gay marriages, and they've called our church particularly. And the only way for us to protect was to put it into our bylaws that this is not something that is sanctioned by our church. But it's up to individual protection. But they are testing this.
Yeah, and I would not be surprised to see court cases or litigation trying to push, expand the envelope, if you will, to try to say that in addition to protecting the right which the Supreme Court has now recognized under the Constitution, and by the way, I believe that case was wrongly decided, and that's an issue that should be decided by the states, and the people of Idaho have voted on that issue. But I think there is undoubtedly going to be an effort in court and probably in legislatures and in Congress to try to expand that to say that everyone else who has a different belief must comply in the conduct of their religious activities and perhaps even in their other activities in ways that I just think are not appropriate. And I think we've got to protect the religious freedom of others as well in this process.
Well, thank you very much for coming down here today. I do appreciate your time. Maybe we'll get you back here one more time. I have many, many questions I'd like to ask you. Yeah.
We didn't finish your list?
No, not quite. No, there's a lot more. I mean, there's the Iran treaty, and there's so many things that we have problems with.
Well, I appreciate this chance to have this visit with you.
Well, thank you very much, and hope we'll see you soon.
Thank you.